Hi there, this is Dr. Hank Liers from Health Products Distributors, and today I'd like to talk about B12, vitamin B12. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the product that I designed for B12, and of course it is in all of our multivitamins, and it is in our energy drinks and where it really needs to be, but back in around the year 2000, when people were seeing how important B12 was and beginning to understand how it affects people who have multiple sclerosis. My pharmacist friend, worked with me, and we designed this vitamin B12 product, and it's a 5 milligram sublingual because we wanted to bypass these absorption problems that people have. And so if you swallow one of our 5 milligram tablets, by passive diffusion, you get about 1% available to the body. 50 micrograms, which is a pretty good shot. The body might not even be able to absorb all of that, but and although it is known that when you get vitamin B12 in the body, it stores in your liver. And if you're a healthy human being, you might have a 5-year supply of B12 in your liver. So putting in extra B12 has no negative consequences. There have never been shown any problems from overdosing. But what you can do is you'll build up your supplies in your liver and kind of guarantee that you don't have B12 problems. It usually gets stored as adenosine cobalamin in your liver, but it can easily convert back to methylcobalamin, and so you have a good supply that way. The other part of the product that I designed is if it goes in sublingually, you bypass all of these problems that you might have with stomach acids and gastric problems and pernicious anemia and so forth. So you can get it in that way as well. So it's kind of a product that guarantees absorption. And what we were finding way back then is that people who had MS, they have lesions in their myelin sheath. And when you have lesions in your myelin sheath, which is what covers your nerves, then your nervous system doesn't function correctly. So this product, and very carefully designed to be sublingual, and has some natural sweeteners in it and natural flavorings in it, that makes it a very pleasant product to take. I wanted to talk just a little bit about what vitamin B12 is, and it is one of the B vitamins. And what you know about the B vitamins is they are not produced in the body, and because of that, and the body needs them, if you don't get adequate B12, then you can contract diseases, pernicious anemia and depression and so on. So it's critical that you get adequate amount of this particular B vitamin. One of the things you need to know about vitamin B12 is, in fact, what it does in the body. And in fact, there's two major pieces that B12 does. One I talked about extensively in my blog article about the methylation cycle, where you produce methyl groups and you recycle methionine back through homocysteine. And those methyl groups are critical for so many functions in the body. And B12 plays a major role in that process of remethylation and recycling of methionine. And in that loop, you also get a component that is critical in the manufacturing of RNA, DNA, nucleic acids, neurotransmitters, etc. And so that particular cycle of the methylation cycle is one of the key ways in which B12 is used in the body. The other key way that B12 is used in the body is in the production of energy. And typically you think of producing energy from carbohydrates, but actually you can produce 40 or 50% of your energy from fats. And under circumstances where you don't have enough carbohydrates or fats, you can actually convert amino acids into energy. And so that process where you take fats and amino acids and you make them into something called L-methylmalonyl coenzyme A, that has to be made into something that can feed into the Krebs cycle, which is the energy cycle of the body. And there is an enzyme that requires vitamin B12, not the same form. It's a different form than in the methylation cycle, which is methylcobalamin. Here we're talking about adenosylcobalamin, and it's critical in order to make succinyl coenzyme A, which feeds into the Krebs cycle, which is where your energy is made. So even though there are just two major cycles in the body that involve genetics and involve the B12, the products that are made because of what they do include ATP, which is the energy source of the body. And without that energy source functioning at a good level, your body doesn't work well. You can have low energy, fatigue, depression, a whole range of things if you don't have adequate energy. The other part, of course, is in the methylation cycle. If you don't have methyl groups, or you don't make RNA and DNA from nucleic acids, then many, many hundreds of cycles in the body are not working correctly. Your DNA oftentimes will be impeded and not function correctly, which is a major problem, which can lead to all kinds of health issues. If you don't make nucleic acids, you don't make adequate RNA and DNA, then you don't make nervous tissue properly, your nerves don't communicate properly. You might have neural tube defects, such as might happen when a child is born and all this development is taking place. And then that can spread, other things can happen. You can have digestive problems and thinking problems where your brain isn't working correctly and so on. So there's a cascade of many, many different functions that don't work correctly if you don't have your B12 working properly with your enzymes. One of the really important things to know is that B12 appears in certain kind of foods and not other foods, but the only way B12 is made in nature is by bacterial fermentation. So you don't make it in the animal bodies, you don't make it in plant bodies. It only comes from what bacteria do, which is really interesting. So these are bacterial organisms, and there's certain bacterial organisms that are very good at making B12. They can make any of the active forms like methylcobalamin and adenosylcobalamin, but they also make hydroxycobalamin, which is a precursor for both the adenosyl and the methylcobalamin forms. And so commercially, they actually use a fermentation process with this specific bacteria, which is GRAS approved. That means generally regarded as safe by FDA, and that you can make supplemental B12 that way and put it in vitamins and put it in foods and so on. The other thing is those same bacteria work in certain animals like cows and then in their stomachs, and when those cows eat grass, those bacteria are on the grass, and now it goes into the cow's body, and in its particular way of digesting, you don't destroy those bacteria, and so they start making B12. Then the cow absorbs it, and whether it goes into the milk or it goes into the meat or the organs, then you get B12 that way. And other animals do that too, like chickens, fish. And so those sources, they're all animal sources, make B12 that you can eat. Generally, there is no B12 in the forms that we're talking about in plants. And so vegans need to be very much aware that they may not be getting adequate amounts of B12. So one of the really important things to know about vitamin B12 is even if you put it in your body, it doesn't mean you're going to absorb it into your system. And there are many reasons for that. And for example, a lot of B12 in the food that we talked about, and beef and chicken and fish and so on, are bound to proteins. And there is something in your mouth, it's an enzyme that's made, or a protein that's made, called haptocorrin, and it protects B12 from stomach acid because B12 is very sensitive to stomach acid. So if you have a deficiency in the production of haptocorrin, you're going to destroy your B12 in your stomach. And then the next phase, the next part of absorption is that in your stomach and your duodenum, just when you go into the small intestine, you actually transfer B12 from the haptocorrin protection mode into connection with something called intrinsic factor. So now you have an intrinsic factor and become B12 product, and that now travels through your small intestine into the ileum, and it's in the ileum where that B12 is taken off or is absorbed with the intrinsic factor, and then that's transferred in your bloodstream to cobalamin 2, and then that is how it gets carried in the blood. So you can see it's a complex process. And if you have pernicious anemia, too much stomach acid, gastritis, irritable bowel syndrome, a microbiome that's not working well, you may not absorb any B12 through that route. And that's a major problem. And so that's key. The next thing is, of course, if you do supplemental B12, that doesn't need to be protected by the haptocorrin. It can just go in, attach to transcobalamin, intrinsic factor, go into your ileum and then get absorbed and transposed. And you get a lot more B12 in that way, if you have stomach issues, especially, as many older people do. And so supplemental B12 is an excellent way of getting more in, but that's not guaranteed either. In other words, if intrinsic factor is messed up because you have pernicious anemia or the wrong conditions in your stomach, then you won't absorb any B12 through the food route or even the supplemental route. So a third way, the third thing that happens is what's called passive diffusion. About 1% of the B12 that you put in, even if it doesn't get absorbed, it just goes through your gut, and 1% of that gets absorbed into your body. So if you take a large dose, like in our B12 product, that's 5 milligrams, or even 1 milligram, then 1% of that will go into your body, get attached to transcobalamin, and get carried through your bloodstream by passive diffusion. And that's why we have a product that's high in the B12 for a lot of people whose systems are not working properly. And of course, that same product can be taken sublingually. That is, when you put that tablet under your tongue, it breaks up, and then B12 goes through your pores and right into your system, and you bypass the whole absorption through the gut methodology. And so you can get it into your body that way. And of course, the other way that a lot of doctors use and people use, if people are really have great problems with B12, is they do injections. So now I want to talk a little bit about deficiency and how would you know you're not getting enough? And it's a very complex issue. But one of the things, there was a major study as a part of a Framingham study from the 1990s, was looking at this whole issue of B12 in people and, you know, how it was absorbed and what the levels of deficiency were. And they showed that up to 40% of the population could be deficient in B12. That is a major deficiency, and that can lead to major illness and major problems. And on top of that, they also showed that even if it looked like you had enough B12, about 50% of patients show diseases when you even measure the B12 levels and you think it's enough. So the need is even greater in some individuals, and it varies. And there's also some discussion about a lot of people think it's primarily older people that have this problem. And it is true. There's a lot of problem with you know, gastric issues and not enough stomach acid and irritable bowel and the microbiome not working well. You might think it's kind of a deficiency is more oriented towards older people, but what they found is across the board, younger people, middle-aged people, and older people had about the same level of deficiencies. And that is a major factor that people need to be aware. It could be that, you know, in an older person it has, you know, worse consequences than in younger people, but it's got bad consequences even in younger and middle-aged people. And certainly in infants, if mothers don't have enough B12 when they give birth, you can get neural tube defects. And most people talk about fixing that with folate, and that's a major factor because it's part of the methylation cycle. But if you have a B12 problem, the methylation cycle doesn't work either, and now you can get neural tube defects just from having a B12 deficiency. Well, I'm going to sign off now, say goodbye. This is Dr. Hank Liers from Health Products Distributors. Thank you for listening, and if you would like to know more, you can go to our blog article and read in depth about what we talked about today. You can go to our website, www.integratedhealth.com.